Hey guys, Aubrey TCG here, and today I'm going to talk to you about the meta. I'm going to be telling where I think each deck fits in the format tier-wise. We're going to go for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Rogue. And I feel like, and I will be talking about these in the standpoint of, I feel these are the most competitive decks and how they stand compared to the other best decks in the format. These aren't particularly ordered, except for top 2. So, you do keep that in mind, that I don't think that any given deck below the top 2 is for sure better than the others in that tier. But, before I get into this, if you could please like and subscribe, that would help a lot. All it takes is 5 seconds to support the channel. Without further ado, let's get into the discussion. Starting off at the top of Tier 1, Kashtira. Konami did not hit this deck hard enough. I don't know what to say. The deck still has an amazing grind game. Birth is still around. Unicorn going to 2 doesn't change much. They still have a lot of ways to search it. And the deck is still really powerful. The deck still is able to do a lot off of resolving a single card, while still having a walking macro. Some decks just cannot get rid of that, or cannot deal with the macro. And the deck's consistency is still very, very good, although it's a lot more bricky now than I think it used to be. And the deck just still does so much. The deck can play through so much, and Birth is a crazy card still. However, it's starting to struggle a little more, but for the most part, it still has a really good matchup spread against pretty much every deck in the format. And while it's seeing a lot of play alongside its other Tier 1 counterparts, I think this one comfortably sits at the top of Tier 1. It's still the best deck, I think, but it's very close now. I think that Sprite and Company, this deck can be played a lot of other ways, is the second best tier 1 deck. Sprite, with whatever engine is playing, is very consistent and does a lot of stuff. And I personally think it's usually a very fair deck. But Sprite and Company, there's a lot of ways to play the deck. You can play it the kind of pile-y way, where they play Live Twins, Runic, and Sprite, as well as a bunch of hand traps, which works really well. Or you can also play just Runic Sprite, which is fine. Runic didn't really get hit. You were only playing 2 mana anyways. You can play just Live Twin Sprite on their own, and they're all really competent decks. Pure Sprite doesn't really do enough, I don't think, and Melfi Sprite is very interesting, but I don't know if it's particularly going to do enough to keep up with the meta. Because Herald is Arclight, which is the common thing I've seen made in Melfi Sprite, is at best. It's sure it's a negate and a macro. This isn't probably not enough. And I feel like Melfi Sprite also just isn't as consistent. But I think any other variant of Sprite essentially is bonkers. Like, really bonkers. Also, Bryn being able to generically jump a level 2 means you can dump early. Or you can dump Angler, and you can just get a lot of advantage off of resolving your extra deck monsters once. The deck does unfortunately still have the weakness of starter going to 2. It's a very good consistency hit, because if the deck loses its normal summon and they have no starter in hand anymore, the deck loses a very decent amount of consistency, because now they don't have a level 2 in order to play with. However, the Runic engines, as well as the Live Twin engine, really help supplement what would have ordinarily been Pure Sprite's weakness. If they lost the level 2 and didn't have starter, then they might just lose on the spot. I think one of the next tier 1 decks is Branded. Branded is absolutely bonkers as well. I think if Kashtira gets banned the heck out of, and we see any hits at all to Sprite, Branded becomes the best deck if the hits to Sprite are meaningful. Because the deck is absolutely wild. It's still able to puppet lock. It's still able to set up like 7 pieces of interaction on your turn. And it's able to banish non-targeting 3 monsters per turn if done right. Like, that's kind of insane, to be honest. The deck's been pretty consistent. We're seeing a lot of the decks top. We're seeing Branded players start to do really well. Part of it was a decrease in Ash for a little bit, but now that we've seen Super Heavy get hit in the ban list, and a few other decks that were causing Ash to be moved out of the format, now that those cards are gone, I think that Ash coming back is going to cause a few problems for Branded. But since we're just playing Cross out at this point, it's not that scary. I think the deck is as consistent as it ever has been or will be, while being able to do so much more off of its cards now. I can't stress this enough, Quem is the card that really brought it all together. And the deck still has so many tools. Puppet Lock isn't as good as it used to be, which is a good thing, I would argue. Not just for the health of the game, but because it forces the Branded players to look into all the other broken tools that we have to set up these insane boards anyways. And I think the deck has a fairly decent matchup spread against all the other decks. And the only problem with it is sometimes it just does not have an out to stuff like the Iblylock. Iblylock is particularly brutal. It loses really hard to D-Rare, which some of the other decks in the format don't. Because they either don't summon from the extra deck, or they are able to play Links, which are not hit by that. And it's just, the deck is insanely good. Even though it has some like very noticeable shortcomings, there's a lot of floodgates that really hurt it. Rivalry really hurts it if they summon it, if you flip it on like something like an Aluber. And Anti-Spell is annoying, but if you don't get to lethal, it spirals downhill really quickly. Non-fusionary and D-Barrier are the biggest weaknesses of the deck, and that's why it has... Also, Eradicator hurts too, but that's why the deck has like a really bad matchup against Labyrinth in particular. It's because of those. You lose the die roll, you're probably losing the set. I'm not gonna lie. And for the most part, Brandon's just in a really good position, and I think if either of the top 2 decks of the format get tapped even a little more, Brandon becomes either like the best deck or damn close to it. My final deck for Tier 1, there is a deck in Tier 2 that I think very nearly was Tier 1, or is Tier 1, that I'll get to in a minute. But I think my final Tier 1 deck is Labyrinth. As I mentioned, really bad matchup for Branded because of access to Eradicator and Barrier. But Labyrinth in general is a very strong deck. It's unfortunate that as cool as the deck is, it likes to use floodgates and very cringe cards. But I think now the deck is in an amazing position. It went pretty much untouched on the ban list, unless you count a pointer as a hit to the deck. I don't. And it has a good matchup spread against a lot of decks. Because while you control a set card, your opponent can't target it. So you can special. This is lovely. Which is why it has such a good matchup. Is you set a card, you can activate a trap card, something, and they can't even target it or beat over it. as long as you've got a set face down card. And targeting protection is very valuable right now, because Kashtira all targets a lot of other removal targets. So having that protection is really good, and having her be able to recur traps and grab traps is so nice. So it has a generally favorable match spread, it's pretty consistent, and doesn't lose to stuff like Barrier or Eradicator. It doesn't lose to the cards it can run. Turn skips don't even work on them fully either. As long as they're able to set at least one card, then it's fine. Deck's really good. Deck's bonkers, honestly. All of tier 1 are extremely good. And I think, though, the only argument, I think the way I have them is the correct order on my list, but it's easily Kashtira best deck with Sprite being really close behind. And I think if they don't check Sprite next ban list, if they check Kashtira more, Sprite immediately becomes best deck. And if both decks get meaningful hits, Branded becomes next best deck if they don't also hit that. I personally don't think they'll hit Branded again. I mean, Expulsion wasn't really a hit, but I just don't think they'll hit Branded again. And I'm gonna say this, Konami really loves Branded, and I think as long as the deck's being a pretty fair tier 1 deck, I don't think they'll hit it too hard, or if they do, it probably won't be meaningful. Now for tier 2, I want to talk about this deck because it could also be tier 1, and I think it probably is. Gold Pride Punk. I think, if anything, it's at the very bottom of tier 1. But Gold Pride Punk is a deck that when it pops off way too hard. That pep that they can make can one-shot over almost anything sometimes. However, I do find that the deck struggles a little bit because of Droll and Lockbird still being around. That card really hurts that deck. And while the deck is consistent, sometimes you draw into a little too much Punk. Just a little too much Punk. Especially if you draw into the one-ofs or trap, then your search targets and your plans have to be really altered around it. And I think the deck is still very good, very consistent, and that it's definitely a deck to watch out for. And I think at best it's bottom of tier 1, and at worst is like top of tier 2. Because this deck can still do some like scary things, but it just doesn't feel as impactful. And I think with the current time rules, until they adjust them, the deck has a similar issue to Dinomorphia, except it's just downright better than Dinomorphia. Really, really amazing deck though, and I think that if it keeps getting played, it should be tier 1, and automatically will be tier 1. My next tier 2 deck I want to talk about is Vanquished Souls. I know it's early, and we haven't seen a whole lot of the Vanquished Souls yet, but I think the deck is easily going to be tier 2, and if we keep seeing it start to top like it is now, then it could move up to tier 1. But for now, it's going to be a tier 2 deck. Some people might say it's a little early to be making big claims like that, but the deck is a very powerful deck. It's just going to take a little bit more time to find people who can break it. And we've seen it start to top events a little bit every now and then. And that's a sign, because the archetype is very good. And I think that its gimmick is very unique too, and it can dodge a lot of things. But for now, we just have to on this one, we have to wait and see what the future holds. If the deck keeps topping, then yeah, it's absolutely tier 2, and you heard it here first, folks. But for now, it's just a solid tier 2, and most people are going to argue rogue deck. But I think it's good enough for tiered status. I also have Pirelli and Super Heavy Samurai in tier 2. Pirelli might have been knocked down back to Rogue. But Super Heavy can still do a lot. It's all 2-card combos now, but the deck still can do a lot and it's still really good as an engine in other decks. Specifically, one I want to point out is my beloved Super Heavy Spiral. But it's just a meaningful engine in some other decks that can do the 2-card combos and then still do their full combos. The deck on its own is still fairly powerful, but it's all 2-card combos and it's not 1-card starters like it was because of Scarecrow's ban. But I definitely think the deck is still something to be absolutely aware for and aware of because it's still really good and will catch you by surprise. Pirelli, I'm not gonna lie, I think putting Pirelli in tier 2 might be a little too high because I think the deck is still going to be relevant to some degree, and I think if anything it stays tier 2 or Rogue. But that limit of Delicious really hurt the deck's consistency with making that like big noir. And then promptly making a Zeus afterwards. With a lot of materials, but the deck can still do a lot. It's a similar situation to Super Heavy where the deck can still do a lot. But I just don't think that it's as good as it was. I think it's still going to hang on. But I know a lot of people aren't as interested in playing it as they were when it was at 3. Definitely think it was the right limit though. And that's all for tier 2. There are some rogue decks that you could essentially argue are tier 2. But for the most part, I think the stuff in rogue stays in rogue. So the first deck I want to discuss in rogue is Traptrix. Traptrix has a pretty decent matchup spread against most of the decks in this format, with the exception of Branded because of Branded lost, and a few other cards that Branded is playing that make it really hard to deal with some of those boss monsters and cause the Traptrix effects to miss timing. And that's the big problem with Traptrix, is that some of their stuff can miss timing. Really funny though. But it has a very good matchup against Kashtira, a very good matchup against a few of these other decks. And honestly, it has a very favorable match spreads for it, and I think Sarah does everything for the deck. Especially, it's a bit of a brutal session versus Labyrinth, though, where things can't be targeted or not affected by traps. But other than that, and a bad matchup against Branded, I think the deck is a very rogue deck. Could argue to be tier 2, but I think it's rogue. Because I think while the deck has a good matchup spread, I just don't think it does enough otherwise to continue winning. And I definitely am excited to see if the deck does top an event eventually or do well at rogue. Another rogue deck that I want to discuss is one that I think is going to continue getting better and better as time goes on, and it's Monadium. The stuff this deck can do as a rogue deck is bonkers, and since Droll seems to be on his way out of the format, I have not been seeing Droll as much recently. And since Droll seems to be seeing its way out of the format, this means Monadium's going to get a lot better. Monadium sometimes had the problem where getting Drolled really hurts. Shuts off a ton of their best play lines and just stops a lot of what they can do. And I personally think that with Droll being less present in the format, that Monadium becomes really good, because it could already do so much as a rogue deck, but its only weakness was Droll having. It gets new support in Dune, which is going to be really good. The new ball Trid makes a world of a difference. It gets the new support in there. It gets support in the next big set with the Vedas that inadvertently work like really well with the Monadiums with how much they destroy. so that you can get the turn skip. And yeah, the deck's just, the only problem is that it loses to Droll, and I think now that Droll's out of the format, the deck's going to become a lot more scary, and it's something you absolutely should watch out for. I think another rogue deck to be aware of is Fluandereeze. And I swear I'm not coping. I swear I'm not coping. Flunder is absolutely a very good rogue deck. It's a combo deck now, and his matchup spread isn't amazing versus anything. But Emben is still a very nasty card to get rid of. Making Apex Avian is still a very, very good negate. Being able to bounce back 3 cards with like Ryza and stack deck is really good. They still use Harpy's Featherstorm, which is a blowout versus some decks. And the deck just still does a lot, even though it lost Barrier Statue. The deck's actually still really good. It's bricky, like Monarchs is. And that's its only main issue, is that it bricks. If it goes off, it goes off. It goes way, way off. And it just does a lot still. But do be aware of that, and do be aware that there's not a lot of side deck cards people are actively side decking right now that really hit the deck because of the way it plays the game. Aside from Summit Limit. Summit Limit will do that. Sword Soul is rogue. I think it's only rogue until Sword Soul figures out what it's wanting to do and figures out the best way to play this format. Because obviously Chixiao or Changying and Chixiao and Baron Blackout Pass isn't enough anymore. It just kind of really loses if it just ends on that, because that board's so susceptible to so much. And the deck is experimenting with Ringoworm, the deck's experimenting with Danglong, and I think once the deck figures out like what it wants to do, what's best for the deck, I think that's when it becomes back to tier 2, back to even tier 1 maybe, along with its fellow branded counterpart. But for the moment, I think it's only rogue at best, because the deck is still in an experimental phase, not really putting up as many results, and I think is not doing enough right now. But once that gets fixed, then it absolutely will go back to tiered status for me. I don't think that Mathmech is rogue per se, but if it is, it's barely holding on. There is still a lot you can do with Mathmech because Circular is still searchable, but Circular to 1, that really hurt the deck a lot. It was a brutal hit, but it's still searchable by like Synapse mining as well as small world bridges, so I think it's absolutely still barely hanging in there. It's definitely something you do have to be aware of, but I just don't think as much it'll be doing as much with that hit. And with the Bestials being played in side deck, it's personally I just think is probably not doing enough. And it's definitely not a bad deck though. I think personally that covers pretty much everything in the format. I think overall we have a very healthy and diverse format, and that the format, aside from a few sacky cards like Barrier and Dimensional Barrier, Dimension Shifter, and Eradicator, stuff like that, I think the format's a very healthy and fun format. And I think if Kashtira gets hit a little more, or they ban the Saki stuff, this becomes one of the most healthy and fun formats we've had in a while. Definitely really excited to see where this format goes. I'm really excited to see how my takes age as the format goes on. And I would like to know what you guys think in the comments about where I place things and about where you would place certain decks right now. Keep it civil though. And until next time, peace.